After making my first video on lost films of the 1920s, I started looking more into that topic, and thought it would be a great idea for a series. So I thought I would make it in the mold of some of my other series, choosing 3 lost films to talk about per video. There are unfortunately so many lost films to choose from, but I chose some that I would especially like to see. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first film I want to talk about is Four Devils, which was directed by F.W. Murnau, the same director who made such famous films as Nosferatu and Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. This one is a bit different from the other lost films I talked about in my previous video, because it was an artistic endeavor rather than just a Hollywood movie made strictly for entertainment. And because it was directed by Murnau, it is currently one of the most sought-after lost films. Sunrise had been Murnau's first Hollywood film, and it was a critical and artistic success, though not a massive hit at the box office. But it was expected not to make a lot of money. At that time, most Hollywood studios permitted one of their top artistic directors to make a prestige film, which was a film that was intended to give a studio a reputation for making artistic masterpieces and increase its prestige, rather than be a big moneymaker. So after the many good critical reviews of Sunrise, a lot of cinephiles were anxiously waiting to see what Murnau would do next. Four Devils was set in a circus, and also had Janet Gaynor playing one of the main characters. The film was divided into 2 main parts. The first part showed 4 orphaned children, 2 boys and 2 girls, who are abused by a circus owner. An older clown saves them from his clutches and beats him up. This kindly old clown lovingly raises the children, and they become an acrobatic circus act in Paris called the Four Devils. They earn enough money to allow their foster father to retire comfortably. 2 of the 4 devils end up getting engaged at some point. As for the other 2, the main female lead, Marion, played by Janet Gaynor, loves Charles, the other orphan boy. Charles promises to marry Marion, but he falls under the spell of a vamp character, played by Mary Duncan. One scene specifically described in multiple reviews talks of the vamp attending the circus show every night, sitting in a seat that Charles swings very close to during the performance, and was described as a fine piece of suggestion. And Marion can't help but pick the vamp out of the crowd during every show. Another especially praised part of the film were the scenes of the circus performance itself, the beginning of which was described by one reviewer like this. In flowing devilish raps, they ride into the ring, each on a white horse, with the clowns preceding them. Their trapezes are lowered. As each of the quartet rides under it, they are taken aloft, their wraps falling off on the way up to the aerial pedestals of the casting turn. Somehow, Charles's affair with the vamp drains his vitality, and his performance suffers. He goes on even though he is in no condition to perform his signature leap of death. After a very suspenseful scene, he safely completes his performance, but his condition worsens due to his relationship with the vamp, which negatively affects Marion as well. Before the final performance of the film, Charles breaks it off with the vamp, though Marion is unaware of it when the final performance begins. There were multiple endings filmed, but at the film's official premiere, this is the ending that was shown. Marion, gravely upset at Charles getting closer with the vamp, consciously lets go of her trapeze during the act and falls, though survives, barely. However, it is important to note that in Murnau's original ending, which was filmed and shown at previews, both Marion and Charles fall to their deaths in the climactic scene. One man's comment from a preview with Murnau's original tragic ending said, "Four Devils is one of the greatest, if not the greatest motion picture that I have ever seen." The man specifically praised the original ending, saying, "For God's sake, don't change the end of the picture." It's unclear how involved Murnau was in reshooting the ending, if he was even involved at all, given that he was very particular about how his films were made, and was not one for compromise when it came to his vision. But either way, the film would be changed once more, this time to its even more severe detriment. Four Devils was first released in October 1928, which was right in the transition period between silence and talkies, and Fox was one of the studios who tried to get in on the talkies right at the start. On its original release, it included a synchronized musical score and sound effects, similar to what had been done with Murnau's previous film, Sunrise. But the transition rapidly accelerated, and now the new novelty was synchronized spoken dialogue. So some scenes including this were tacked on, and the film was re-released. But by that point, Murnau was no longer working at Fox and had no input in the matter. The new additions were disastrous. Other late silent films had the same treatment, but this was especially grievous when done to a film that was trying to be a serious artistic endeavor. The new dialogue was, in one contemporary reviewer's opinion, stupid, out of place, and destructive rather than an aid. From the moment the players began uttering absurd lines in the latter sequences, the picture fell to pieces, and the tragedy happens to the picture, not within it. This re-released version was mostly advertised as a novelty because it was Janet Gaynor's talkie debut, a far cry from what the film was originally intended to be. Murnau's original film had been picked apart for the sake of money. The original ending certainly seemed more befitting of a tragedy, but not just because there's more death. If both Marion and Charles died, it shows how Charles's bad decisions not only dragged him down, but also dragged down Marion with him, despite the fact that she hadn't made any bad decisions. Her love for him would end up punishing her. But for the time, maybe that was just too out there for a mainstream audience to handle. One reviewer, who was aware of the different endings, illustrated this with their statement, "But could the lovely Janet be permitted to die? Hardly." The public might have resented one of their favorite screen idols being killed off in a movie. It seems very likely that the business side of Hollywood really put a damper on Murnau's vision, and ultimately affected the quality of the film negatively. Here are just some other random notes about Four Devils that I found through looking at movie magazines from that time. There was a general impression that Mary Duncan, who played the vamp, was the highlight amongst the main characters, despite the fact that, by all accounts, her technique was a very outdated and exaggerated way of portraying a vamp. Janet Gaynor was a darling of the movie magazines, fans, and critics alike, but many reviewers thought that she wasn't used to her full ability in Four Devils, and that any criticism of her performance should not be placed on her. The performance of Anders Randolph, who played the abusive circus owner, was singled out as being the most animated of the cast, despite having a rather minor role. Some critics also said that the pacing of the film was too slow, especially at the beginning, something which was pretty common for artistic films back then, and really it's the same even nowadays. The actors portraying the Four Devils had to undergo intensive acrobatic training for their roles. Nancy Drexel was quoted as saying of the experience, "It's really a lot of fun, more fun than I've had in a picture in a long while, and I'll be sorry when the picture's over and we can't do our trapeze exercises anymore." Just as a demonstration of how big an event movie premieres could be at that time, at the premiere of Four Devils at the Gaiety Theater in New York City, opening night tickets were $5.50 for orchestra seats, which would be about $90 today, and $3 for balcony seats, which would be almost $50 today. The only known copy of the film had been in the possession of actress Mary Duncan, who had played the vamp, but there was no trace of it after that, though it's possible that it might still be part of her estate. Four Devils continues to be one of the most sought-after lost films, mostly because it was a serious effort by F.W. Murnau, who made other films now regarded as masterpieces. Although reviews for the film were mixed, at least from what I was able to find, films with a more artistic bent are sometimes misunderstood in their time, and age very well years or decades later, before eventually achieving a godlike status. Though in this case, the mixed reception was almost definitely caused in large part by Hollywood's tampering. I'm certain that I'm not alone when I say that I think keeping the original tragic ending would really help the film stand out and improve its reputation if it was still extant. At that time, very few Hollywood movies had unhappy endings, certainly not as sad as the two main characters dying. But Murnau never strove to make strictly entertainment. Though if the film is found, that print would probably have the alternate happy ending, since that's what was released publicly and distributed. Was Four Devils a masterpiece of silent film, or was it simply an above-average Hollywood movie in terms of production, though had noticeable flaws in its story and execution? Let's all hope that someday we'll know for sure. Okay, the next film I want to talk about is probably one that few people have heard of, but its story and background were fascinating to me, and I was able to find quite a bit of information about it. It's titled Wine, and is immediately intriguing because it was Clara Bow's first starring role back in 1924. Practically everyone interested in the 1920s knows and loves Clara Bow for her influence on American pop culture in the Jazz Age. But Wine also contained so many other things that we now consider quintessentially 1920s. It had illegal booze, flappers, and crazy jazz parties. What more could you want from a 1920s movie? Even in 1924, it was being called, along with other movies, a Jazz Age film. There's only one problem. It was ardently pro-prohibition. In fact, a contemporary reviewer called it a propaganda film for its direct and strong stance against illegal alcohol. There was a foreword at the beginning of the film from the head of Universal Pictures, Carl Laemmle himself, telling the audience of his distaste for illegal drinking, saying, "If there is anything in the world I despise, it is a bootlegger." Perhaps if we could watch the movie now, it might gain the reputation of being unintentionally funny, as in Reefer Madness. As for the story, I think the best way to tell it is through one contemporary summary from the Exhibitor's Trade Review. John Warrener, threatened with bankruptcy, is persuaded by his wife to join one Benedict in a bootlegging enterprise, just as his daughter is about to make her social debut. Carl Graham, a square chap, loves the daughter, but she falls for the attentions of Van Alstyne, member of a fast set. She is trapped with Van Alstyne in a raid made by federal officers on a cafe, and rescued by Carl. Warrener goes to jail. His wife loses her sight as a result of drinking bad liquor, but he is finally released. His wife regains her eyesight, and his daughter marries Carl Graham. Reviews of Wine seem to be mixed. Carl Sandburg wrote of the movie, "The picture is a snappy, zippy, overdrawn sketch of life as it is lived in the underworld, and among the upper classes. If not taken as information, it is cracking good entertainment." Photoplay magazine wrote that the plot was weak. However, I was able to find a lengthy, rather negative review that I would like to share in full, so here it goes. This picture starts out by frankly stating in a foreword that it is propaganda in favor of exterminating the bootlegger and those who aid in the dispensing of illicit liquor. But as a matter of fact, it registers rather as plain melodrama, the plot of which pivots on rum running and the consequences thereof, with jazz and flapper trimmings, the sort of thing which has served as screen material quite frequently of late. Viewed from any angle, Wine cannot be classified as a film of extraordinary merit. It belongs in the program list and should do pretty fair business in the average house before an average audience. But on the whole, it doesn't measure up to the high-water mark of the usual Jewel productions. 3 members of the Warrener family suffer as a result of their connection with the purchase and absorbing of hooch in defiance of the Volstead Decree. Papa Warrener gets in bad through partnership with the bootlegger. Mother goes temporarily blind through overindulgence in the forbidden stuff. Daughter flaps into an ugly mess of liquor and jazz complications. And there is the customary round of gay parties and convivial excess, with which movie fans are quite familiar. There are many exciting situations, among which may be mentioned the Roadhouse raid and heroine's narrow escape from officers of the law, with her faithful lover coming to the rescue. Shots of a floating cafe in the shape of a vessel anchored safely outside the 12-mile limit and catering to thirsty Gothamites are very interesting. All the more so because a New York morning newspaper recently printed an article dealing with the activities of a steamer engaged in such traffic just off Fire Island. The moral lesson the producers hint at in the foreword loses its edge somewhat when the climax presents the mother as recovering from her whiskey blindness, daughter happy with her fiancé, and father pulling loose from the clutches of the law. There is an abundance of fine photography, exteriors and interiors are skillfully filmed, and excellent lighting prevails. Clara Bow is effective as the flapper heroine. Forrest Stanley not so convincing as the honest hero. Huntley Gordon furnishes a capital character sketch of John Warrener, and the support is adequate. You can exploit this as an up-to-date melodrama with a modern theme. Play up the bootlegging angle and flapper stuff. The names of Clara Bow, Forrest Stanley, Huntley Gordon, and Myrtle Stedman are worth featuring. Another negative review, this one from Motion Picture Magazine, said, "As screen fare, it is a rather aimless and wholly conventional flapper film. The development of the episodes is very tiresome after several rounds of gaiety over the cheering cups. But there's also an interesting little aside concerning this movie that you heard one of the previous reviews mention. Before the movie was released, a writer from the New York Herald Tribune claimed to have discovered a vessel anchored 15 miles off of New York and operating as a floating bar. Coincidentally, there was a similar ship in Wine, which was called the 12-Mile Cafe, referring to the prohibition rule that if you were more than 12 miles offshore, you could legally consume alcohol. Wine was originally planned to be released in late December 1924, but because of this hot scoop in the news, they pushed up its release date to August to take advantage of the exposure, and proceeded to milk it for all it was worth. Some apparently found the coincidence suspicious, and Universal even had to officially state that they had nothing to do with the news story, which turned out to be a hoax anyway, and had not conjured it up as publicity for Wine. So, while Wine was probably not a masterpiece and also took a now unpopular stance on prohibition, I think it would be a fantastic movie in terms of pop culture for how it combined so many quintessentially 1920s things all in one. If this film is ever found, I'm sure anyone making videos on prohibition or alcohol in the 1920s would use clips from it as perfect 1920s footage for that. By the early 1920s, Hollywood had become a mainstream sensation, with many die-hard fans who knew movies and movie stars like the back of their hand. Hollywood had successfully built a cult of sorts surrounding its movies and industry, and it loved depicting movie stars living glamorously and giving average people a glimpse into their totally real and definitely not staged private lives. But it also liked to stress that becoming a movie star wasn't easy, and breaking into the movies was about as likely, or even less so, than winning the lottery. The early 1920s saw a rise in Hollywood looking in at itself, and making self-deprecatory jokes. Stories about average people trying to break into the movies abounded on film and in print in the various movie magazines. The movie Hollywood from 1923 followed that exact formula. But it pulled off something with far more novelty value than the others. It featured cameos from more than 60 movie stars. Most of the biggest stars of the day made an appearance, including Charlie Chaplin, Bebe Daniels, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Baby Peggy, William S. Hart, Thomas Magan, Pola Negri, and Will Rogers. It also featured Wallace Reed's last film appearance, and was released 6 months after his premature death. But the most interesting cameo is from Fatty Arbuckle, nearly 2 years after a murder scandal ruined his career. Almost definitely intended as a very dark joke, his appearance featured him as an out-of-work actor applying for a job at a studio, but the casting director's window is closed to him. Of this cameo, one reviewer wrote, "When Mr. Arbuckle turned his face around and was recognized by the audience, there was an outburst of heart applause which lasted as long as he was on the screen. Whether this was an unusual occurrence or whether it happens at every performance, we do not know." Thomas Magan was another featured cameo, and I found a pretty long description of his appearance, which I will quote here. "Thomas Magan will be seen in his favorite pose. He is shown in the picture with 12 little children getting ready to go on location with his director, Alfred E. Green, and other members of the cast. For his bit in the picture, Magan stops at the newsstand of the Southern Pacific Station in Los Angeles and buys chocolate for all the kiddies. Judging from the smile he wore while making the scene, Tommy had the time of his life with the youngsters. While in the act of buying candy, Magan stops long enough to greet Hope Hampton, Gertrude Astor, Lila Lee, and Will Rogers, and write directions for the girl in the picture to find her way to Hollywood. The main female character also meets Mary Pickford when she delivers a dress to her, and Mary calls out for Douglas Fairbanks to meet the girl, which he does. Hollywood also featured some non-acting luminaries from the movie industry, including Sid Grauman and Cecil and William DeMille. In fact, in more than one review, Cecil DeMille's acting was praised, though I couldn't find out what the context of his cameo was. As such a unique novelty, the main cast of characters, practically out of necessity, were made up of unknown actors. Also out of necessity, the story was pretty weak, though I don't think anyone went into that movie thinking that it would be anything special. By reading through numerous reviews and summaries of the film, I've been able to piece together the story. Unlike the other Lost films I've covered in the past where I just read a summary from a movie magazine, I was able to grab little details from various sources, and I made my own summary using that information. So, here it goes. A young woman named Angela from a small Midwestern town thinks she has what it takes to become a movie star after her friend tells her she can succeed. Angela's family is poor, and her family's home burns down. Her elderly grandmother urges her to pursue her dream, and even sells off the land where the burned-down house was in order to pay for her granddaughter's trip to Hollywood. Angela's grandfather is in poor health, so he accompanies her to Hollywood for a change of air. Almost immediately, the grandfather lands a job from a movie director and gets steady work. He is an honored guest at many movie stars' homes. Angela goes from studio to studio but gets nowhere, even though she's beautiful. So she has to live off of her grandfather's earnings. The grandfather sends money back home so that his wife, the grandmother, can come to Hollywood, and she brings along an old family maid. Again, almost immediately, both get jobs in the movie business by accident. Then the rest of the family move to Hollywood as well. Angela's father, mother, and sister all get jobs at the studio simply because they are the right types. Her father has a perfect nose for a part, and her sister has big feet that apparently help her get a part as well. Also along comes a young man who wants to marry Angela, so he sells his pants-pressing business to come follow her to Hollywood and gets a job in westerns. But Angela still can't get a job in Hollywood. She gives up and decides to settle down and get married, presumably to the young man who wanted to marry her. She has twins named Doug and Mary, and even they are able to land jobs in movies. This is especially amusing considering that Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford both made cameos. Reviews of the movie seem to have been pretty positive. Nobody expected it to be a piece of high art or anything, but its entertainment value was deemed more than sufficient. And of course, the biggest attraction was the unprecedented number of big names featured in it. The movie clocked in at about an hour and 40 minutes. Considering that the beginning had to set up the light story for, let's say, about 20 minutes or so, that leaves an hour and 20 minutes to fit in more than 60 cameos. That's close to a cameo every 2 minutes. It was truly a parade of stars. It did its advertising for itself. An Exhibitors magazine said simply of advertising for the movie, "Promise them a load of laughs, real ones. There shouldn't be any exploitation diagnosis necessary. You know best how to get them in. Do it." As for how much money the movie made, I couldn't find any good figures outside of those for individual first-run theaters. But that same Exhibitors magazine said, "Spells success for the exhibitor. Hollywood should be a cleanup. This is more strictly and more intimately a look into Movieland than the others. They'll eat it up. Hollywood will undoubtedly prove one of the biggest moneymakers of the year, unless the dope is way off." There was only really one negative review of the film that I found, but it wasn't too harsh. The author just complained that, "Too bad Hollywood aspired to be a feature picture. What a great newsreel it would have made." So basically, if you didn't expect Hollywood to be an artistic masterpiece, then it sounds like a blast. This was absolutely a fan service to the countless Hollywood superfans in the US and elsewhere in the world, who I'm sure would have gone to see the movie multiple times just to make sure they caught every cameo. It seems like it had plenty of inside jokes, and was probably the best of these Hollywood propaganda films. The light commentary that Hollywood the movie made about Hollywood the industry is also a bit interesting. In the July 26, 1923 issue of Variety magazine, one reviewer said, "The story brings out that neither beauty nor youth has first call in the studios, but types are more eagerly accepted, with much more decision in their selection. It's sad that we no longer have this wonderful documentation of Hollywood not taking itself too seriously. But there's always a slim chance that it will be found someday, though it becomes more difficult for every day that goes by." So, which of these 3 films would you like to see the most? Let me know in the comments. And if you have suggestions for other 1920s lost films I could cover in a future video, leave a comment for that too. I have some other films in mind for future installments in this series, but I'm always looking for more. I'll leave the same links I did in part 1 of this series in the description, so if you want to contribute to organizations trying to find lost films like those featured in this video, as well as thousands of others that are currently missing, please consider helping them out. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.